Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. In today's video I'm going to cover the 5 most important things you need to know about mixing the correct paint consistency so that you can produce a professional looking watercolor painting. So while I'll be painting an outback landscape scene, what I really want you to do is to concentrate on how I mix my various paint consistencies while also being aware of how wet my paper is. This watercolor basics video is a follow-on on the one I did about how to hold your watercolor brush to create various shapes and edges in your painting. And in case you haven't seen that, I'll put a link to it in the description below. But for now, let's begin with this painting. As usual with a landscape painting like this, I start by thoroughly wetting the back of my paper. Not the front, just the back. So while the paper is absorbing that water, let's mix some colours. The sky is the biggest part of this painting, and it's also the lightest part. Quite often the sky is the lightest part of your painting. And the next largest shape is the ground. So we'll begin by mixing a cool violet and you can see that's quite a weak mix. And the way to test your colour is you don't want a lot of paint in your brush, just press lightly and drag your brush, and that gives you a good indication of what tone you have mixed. And then the sky goes from this colour to a dull blue. So for that I'll use some cobalt blue. I'll add a little bit of permanent rose. And that's pretty good for that. And then for the ground, it's a reddish soil, so I'll pick up some of this Scarlet Lake. Cad red would do, any other warm red should be okay. And that's going to be okay to start with. So when you're painting a landscape, the colours and the distance of similar objects, so think the ground is the object we're talking about, the ground and the distance is going to be lighter in tone than the ground in the foreground. So for us, this is good enough as a starting colour. And you can see here, these are relatively weak mixes. You can tell it's quite a weak mix. See how the paint sloshes around? Later, as I add more and more paint, you'll see that the paint does not flow the same way. But again, just to reiterate, it's very important that you test your colours, preferably on a piece of watercolour paper similar to the paper you're using, so that you know what you've mixed. If you look at the palette, see how much stronger these colours appear, but really this is the colour I've mixed. They only appear stronger because of the amount of paint there, or the depth of paint there, so keep that in mind. Let's go back and wet the back of this again. This has absorbed most of the water. Wet the board. Now I've moved the moon here a little bit to the left rather than leaving it in this position. It just helps balance the painting a little bit better. Before I do anything else, I'm going to get some clean water and paint around the moon shape. That will effectively pre-wet that part of the painting. This way, when I'm painting the sky, the paint will very easily flow around the circle of the moon. Now I haven't wet this part of the paper. The reason for that is because I've already mixed these colours and I already know what their tone is. If I was then to wet the paper first, when I start to paint, the water on the paper will immediately dilute the tone of my paint, in which case there was no reason to be testing these colours. As soon as you start painting, you're effectively wetting the paper from that point on. Now I'll just go into the blue and I'll paint into the pink. See how we're dragging that bead of paint down the paper. I want this transition to be a bit softer. So I'll just go back in, pick up some of this blue. Just adding some cad orange to that mix. Now as I come forward, I'm going to add more Scarlet Lake, a little bit of Permanent Rose, and some burnt sienna as well to dull it off, because it's not a very bright red. That's a bit too thick. I'll have to dilute it with a little bit of water. And you can see now the paint is not quite sloshing around as much, and when we test it next to our previous or initial mix, you can see how much stronger it is in tone. Quick brush marks. I want to leave some broken edges. Some of those will be nice little highlights on top of rocks later. I'll add some more paint, because again, as the ground gets closer to us, as I said before, it gets stronger in tone. Now in the distance there's some brown grasses there, so I'm just getting some raw umber. I'm going to run that across there. Let's put some there. And you can see some of these lines on the ground, so I'm just hinting at some of those with this mix here. And then to add a little bit more interest here, I'm going to thicken the paint some more, and we're going to do some splatter. So I'll pick up a couple of brush loads of this. I'm going to darken it with a little bit of French ultramarine. Then I'll pick up more paint. Now you can see how gluggy that is. And again, if we go back and test it against this mix, you can see how much stronger in tone it is. Vary the mix, add a bit more French ultramarine to that. Now that's hardly flowing at all, and it's probably a bit too thick. Well, I'll show you what happens if I use that. No, that's okay. It's flowing a little bit. So I'm just creating the impression of stones and pebbles on the ground. Alright, I need to dry this now so I can go in and paint the trees in the distance and then the rocks. Now I've just dried that enough so that the top layer is dry, but the paper underneath is still quite wet, which is why the paper is still sitting very flat on my board and isn't sliding around anywhere. I'm going to mix two different green colours. Because there's very little light in this scene, none of them are going to be very bright. So I'll start with some raw umber. Just going to clean the top of this French ultramarine because it's a bit too much of these reds in it at the moment. Good. So this is a mix of raw umber, a little bit of French ultramarine, some aureolin and a little bit of cobalt turquoise. And this will be the same mix of colours, except I'm going to make it thicker. And you make it thicker by adding more paint or having less water in your mix. There we go. So you can see the tonal difference between the lighter tone and the darker tone. Now when you clean your brush, and I only cleaned it because I wasn't sure what colour was in it, so I just cleaned it and then I tap the brush onto a towel. Effectively you want to take out most of the water. Otherwise, if you just clean your brush, pick up a load of water, mix it in there, you immediately dilute the colours, right? Now the other thing to remember, because I've dried this, why did I dry it? Well, now I want sharper edges. If I had painted with these greens while the sky was still wet, all I would get is soft edges. So I'll start with this lighter tone. Leave gaps in the foliage. Think of them as bird holes. Barely touching the paper. And now I'll go into this darker tone. Now this is too weak. Because I picked up this paint and painted into the wet foliage, so see how that foliage, all of this foliage still has a shine on it? I fully expected a soft edge, but the fact that it just bloomed that much tells me this mixture is not thick enough. So I'm going to add more paint to it. mainly raw umber and French ultramarine. With practice, you don't have to check every time. I know this is stronger in tone than this. I'll show you. Because I just added more paint and no more water, so it had to be stronger in tone. I'm darkening most of this foliage now because most of it is quite dark in the reference. I'm going to spray that just to make the paint flow a little bit more. And I keep the spray bottle perpendicular to the paper, so the biggest drops land away from the paper and only the lightest ones land on the surface of the paper. What that does is it keeps these little bird hole shapes dry because the tiniest droplets are attracted to the wet portions only. And you can see now how those colours are flowing into one another. I've just picked up some burnt sienna and French ultramarine. And with that, I'll paint in some of these tree trunks and branches. I'm going to get my stiff hog hair fan brush, and I'm going to break up any of these edges that appear too straight or too sharp. Just little dabs like that. Throw in some grasses. Drag the brush forward, pull it back a little bit and change direction. That'll do. And now I need to dry this so I can paint these rocks. Primarily I'm going to use some cad orange with a little bit of this pink colour that I still had there. And you start with your weakest mix, so effectively the lightest tone. And now we need to give it some form. So right now those rocks are looking very flat. So let's strengthen these mixes. add a little bit of the cobalt blue just to dull it off. So now we've got some lighter tone and mid-tones, and let's go in with some even stronger mixes now. Because of this thicker paint, you can see it's not flowing down the paper as fast. And there'll be a shadow where the rock connects to the ground. So for that, to this mixture, add some French ultramarine. And once again, see how much thicker this paint is and darker in tone. The darker tone in part is also because I've added French ultramarine to it. Use some of this darker mix just to throw a mark underneath some of these . Now if we look at these rocks, you can see it's quite shiny down here, not so much at the tops. So if I wanted to add more texture to it, put in some more sort of angular lines, I can get a credit card, or this is a piece of a credit card, an old credit card, and use that to scrape in some texture. And see effectively what I've done by scraping some of that paint. The paint I've scraped away has connected with the paint that wasn't touched and left some nice dark textural lines. If they're too much, you can just lightly go over them. And then you can pick up some of this thicker paint make that thicker still. If you want just a little bit of extra water, rather than dipping your brush in water, find some area of your palette that has a small amount of moisture and just grab that. And this is almost pure paint that I'm picking up here, because I'm painting into an area that's still a little bit wet. Now these rocks look a little bit too harsh to me, so I'm going to get some clean water and just run that over the top to add a little bit more life to the wash. It was looking a little bit muddy or overworked. I'm just putting in some slightly bigger rocks just to add a bit more interest down here. I'll get my fan brush. Just create a dull brown. again reasonably thick, and I'm going to use that to throw in some grasses. And again, this paint, you can see it's not flowing into itself very much, so I'm aware of that consistency, and I want to darken some of these areas around this rock. Here I don't have a lot of paint in my brush, so even though it's the same tone as this, I'm only depositing a small amount of paint. So I don't want this to be as strong as this area here in tone. It's too strong. I'm just lifting a little highlight at the top of these rocks. I think we'll throw some birds in the sky. So hopefully you've kept an eye on how I started with my lighter tones, kept increasing the tone as I come forward, so lighter tone in the distance on the ground, stronger tone in the foreground. But I also took into account how wet is my paper whenever I wanted to paint into it, and I was also able to just use water to modify the consistency of paint that's already on my paper to create some interesting effects. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. And if you're able to support me on Patreon, that would be great as well. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.